In the copper-rich hills of Katanga Province, during the summer of 1959, where the earth bled red with mineral wealth and the Congo River carried the weight of a continent's sorrow, there unfolded an event that would never appear in any colonial record or independence newspaper. La Colline Dorée, the Golden Hill Estate, stood like a monument to extraction and excess, its whitewashed walls gleaming under the equatorial sun while thousands toiled in the mines below. What the Belgian administrators and Congolese elite who'd gathered there on that January evening could never have imagined was that their celebration of union and prosperity would transform into something far darker. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In a single night, 17 members of Katanga's most influential families would succumb to an affliction that doctors traveling from Élisabethville could neither explain nor cure. Their final moments were marked by expressions that would haunt the few survivors who'd witnessed them. The answer to this mystery resided not in any laboratory or medical text, but in the calloused hands of a woman who had discovered that the forest holds secrets older and more potent than any colonial power. This is the account of Amara Kiboko, a cook who understood that certain ingredients could nourish, while others could deliver a justice that courts would never provide. A woman who chose to honor the memory of Patrice Lumumba by taking his name when she decided her life would no longer be defined by others' cruelty. The Golden Hill Estate sprawled across nearly 3,000 acres of Katanga's richest mining territory, its boundaries marked by eucalyptus trees that the Belgian colonials had imported to remind them of Mediterranean summers. The main house sat atop the highest point, a sprawling structure that married Art Deco sensibilities with tropical practicality. Its wide verandas designed to catch any breeze that might offer relief from the relentless heat. Below the mansion, visible from every window on the eastern side, stretched the mining operations that generated the family's enormous wealth. Copper ore glinted in the sun as workers moved in choreographed patterns that spoke of rigid discipline and unforgiving quotas. The processing facilities sent up constant plumes of smoke that painted the evening sky in shades of amber and rust. Monsieur Laurent Muamba had inherited this empire from his father, a Congolese man who had collaborated with Belgian colonials in the early days of Leopold's control, growing wealthy while others suffered. Laurent had expanded the operation with calculated precision, navigating the complex politics of late colonial rule while positioning himself to thrive regardless of which way independence winds might blow. He was a tall man with a face carved from ironwood, his features revealing nothing of his thoughts, his eyes the color of Congo mahogany and just as impenetrable. He ruled his workers with a philosophy he often expressed to visiting administrators. Calculated harshness, balanced with strategic generosity, maintained productivity better than pure brutality. A worker who believed he might earn privileges through loyalty worked harder than one who had abandoned all hope. The crown jewel of Laurent's domain was neither the copper nor the sprawling house, but rather the culinary reputation that drew visitors from across the province and beyond. Colonial officials making circuits through Katanga ensured their routes passed through Lubumbashi specifically to secure invitations to dine at La Colline Dorée. Trading magnates who navigated the complex networks of extraction and export considered an invitation to the Muamba table a mark of status. Other wealthy Congolese families, those who had found ways to profit within the colonial system, competed for opportunities to be seen in Laurent's dining room. The architect of this gastronomic fame was a woman whose face most guests never saw, but whose genius they savored with every perfectly balanced dish. Amara had arrived at the estate as a girl of 9 in 1941, part of a group transferred from a collapsed plantation in Kasai Province, where her parents had died during an outbreak of sleeping sickness. The estate's head cook, an elderly woman called Mama Nanja, immediately recognized something exceptional in the quiet child with watchful eyes and an uncanny memory for every flavor she encountered. For nearly 15 years, Amara absorbed not merely cooking techniques, but entire systems of knowledge. Mama Nanja had been born in a village deep in the Kasai forests before being brought to work in colonial kitchens as a young woman. She carried within her the accumulated wisdom of generations, knowledge about which leaves could draw out fever, which roots could ease the pain of childbirth, which mushrooms could send a person into dreams from which they might never wake. The old woman taught Amara that the forest spoke in a language older than any human tongue, that every plant carried purpose encoded in its structure. She would say during their evening sessions, when the kitchen finally grew quiet, that their ancestors had understood these languages since before the white men arrived, since before even the Arab traders, since the first people learned to distinguish food from poison and medicine from curse. This knowledge lived in the blood and bones of their people, passed through whispered instruction and careful observation, an inheritance that existed beyond any legal document or bill of sale. Mama Nanja also did something that could have gotten them both severely punished. She taught Amara to read and write, first in Kikongo, then in French. During the long rainy season evenings, when kitchen demands decreased, she showed the girl how to form letters in flour spread on the table, how to decipher the French recipe books that Madame Villetti consulted, how to maintain secret records of discoveries and observations. The elder cook emphasized repeatedly that knowledge represented the only possession that could never be confiscated. A woman who could read could learn anything. A woman who could write could bear witness even when others tried to erase her existence. When Mama Nanja finally passed in 1954, dying peacefully in her sleep after 50 years of service, Amara naturally assumed her position. She was 23 years old, recently married to Bakari, a skilled metal worker who crafted tools for the mining operation, and already mother to 3 children. Ntumba had been born in 1951, Kadima in 1953, and little Baraka in 1955. The family occupied a cabin in the workers' quarters that was slightly larger than standard, a privilege granted because Amara's importance to the estate's reputation made her valuable beyond typical measure. Laurent rarely addressed Amara directly, conducting his culinary requirements through Madame Veronique, a pale woman who had been educated in Brussels and carried herself with the brittle elegance of fine porcelain. Veronique spent her days orchestrating the household, consulting fashion magazines shipped from Europe, and medicating her persistent anxiety with laudanum that arrived in regular parcels from Élisabethville. The kitchen at La Colline Dorée was Amara's territory. The space was enormous, built to accommodate the preparation of elaborate multi-course dinners for dozens of guests. A massive cast-iron stove imported from France dominated one wall, its multiple ovens capable of maintaining different temperatures simultaneously. Shelves lined with copper pots and serving pieces gleamed in the light from high windows. The pantry rivaled those found in fine hotels in Leopoldville, stocked with imported European staples alongside the best local ingredients that money could secure. Amara commanded a staff of 4 younger women.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Each trained personally in specific disciplines. Nima handled all baking, her bread achieving a lightness that seemed impossible given Katanga's humidity. Asha prepared meats with such skill that even the toughest bush game emerged tender. Tumelo managed preservation, keeping the pantry stocked with pickles, jams, and conserves that lasted through both rainy and dry seasons. But Amara retained the most crucial knowledge for herself alone. She was the only one who prepared the complex sauces that made guests close their eyes in appreciation. She personally determined smoking times and temperatures for preserved meats. She alone knew which combinations of herbs could transform a simple dish into something transcendent. The children lived primarily in the workers' quarters with other families, but often appeared at the kitchen when Amara needed to supervise them during work. Ntumba, at 8 years, already showed fascination with his father's craft, spending hours at the forge when permitted, learning to read metal's changing colors as it heated. Kadima, at 6, had inherited her mother's curiosity about plants, sometimes accompanying Amara on expeditions to collect herbs from the forest's edges near the estate. Baraka, still small at 4 years, was content with simple pleasures, playing with carved wooden animals that Bakari crafted during rare free moments. Life at La Colline Dorée followed predictable rhythms. Within the harsh constraints of their circumstances, the family had achieved a form of stability. Amara had created protection through indispensability. Laurent would never sell or transfer the cook who guaranteed his social standing, and, by extension, would never separate her family. It was an illusion constructed carefully over years, built on the false assumption that usefulness could serve as insurance. She failed to recognize that security for those without power was always provisional, always dependent on the whims of those who held absolute authority over their lives. Philippe Mwamba, Laurent's eldest son, had recently completed his studies in Brussels. At 23 years old, he embodied a particular type of cruelty that emerged from privilege untempered by responsibility. His father's calculated approach to domination had been refined in Philippe into something more casually vicious. During his university years in Belgium, he had developed tastes for amusements that involved exercising power over those who could not resist or complain. His Belgian classmates had taught him that certain people existed primarily to serve, that boundaries were for those who could enforce them, that consequences were things that happened to others. Amara had noticed how Philippe looked at her younger staff members when he visited the kitchen, how he manufactured excuses to appear when his father was occupied elsewhere. She had implemented a policy of constant supervision, ensuring the girls were never isolated when Philippe was present. But she could not be everywhere simultaneously, and Philippe had infinite time and absolute authority. What Amara did not know was that Philippe had begun noticing her children during their visits to the kitchen, and that his twisted psychology had identified in them an opportunity for the sort of entertainment he considered perfectly acceptable. After all, they were merely workers' children, and such children needed to understand their place in the world's hierarchy. These were lessons, he told himself, valuable instruction in the natural order of things. During the hot afternoons of the dry season, when mining operations slowed slightly to accommodate the heat, Philippe often wandered the estate grounds seeking diversions. He had developed a particular interest in what he called educating the workers' children about proper respect and obedience, devising games that he described to his Belgian friends in letters as character-building exercises, though their actual nature was considerably darker. Amara sensed the growing unease in the workers' quarters when Philippe appeared. Mothers pulled children closer. Men found urgent tasks that required their complete attention. Conversations died mid-sentence as people became suddenly fascinated by their own hands. But she could not have imagined that her own children would soon become the primary focus of the young master's attention, that her careful protections would prove as substantial as morning mist when confronted with casual malice backed by absolute power. The estate functioned as its own small kingdom, operating under unwritten laws that everyone understood but no one dared articulate. At the apex stood Laurent, followed by his family, then the handful of white administrators and technical specialists, and finally the Congolese workers in their own internal stratifications. Amara had learned to navigate this system with great care, using her privileged position to shield her family as much as possible. But protection, she was about to discover, was an illusion that could shatter in a single moment of arbitrary cruelty. The dry season of 1958 descended on Katanga with its characteristic intensity, baking the red earth until it cracked, and sending up dust devils that danced across the mining fields like spirits made visible. It was a season that Amara typically appreciated despite the heat, as the reduced rain meant more stable supplies and fewer concerns about food spoilage. The kitchen work intensified during this period as the estate hosted more frequent gatherings to entertain the steady stream of officials, traders, and other notables who passed through the region. That November morning began as countless others had. Amara arose before dawn, as she always did, lighting fires in the great stove and beginning preparations for the household's breakfast. Bakari had already departed for the forge, and the children still slept deeply on their mats in the family cabin.
Pre-dawn hours, almost pleasant, though everyone knew the heat would become oppressive by mid-morning. The day ahead promised to be significant. Laurent had announced that he would be hosting a meeting of regional mining operators and government officials, the sort of gathering that required Amara's finest work. It was an opportunity to demonstrate that Colline Dorée remained the standard by which all other establishments should be measured, regardless of the political transformations that independence might bring. Amara had planned the menu with her usual meticulous attention. She would prepare a soup that blended European techniques with local ingredients, followed by roasted guinea fowl with a sauce that incorporated wild forest mushrooms she had gathered herself, accompanied by carefully selected sides that would showcase both technical skill and creative vision. For dessert, she had planned her interpretation of a French tart that had become her signature, adapted with local palm sugar and tropical fruits that transformed it into something entirely new. As she supervised her staff through the morning preparations, Amara allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had built something remarkable here, transforming the estate kitchen into an operation that rivaled the finest restaurants in Élisabethville or even Leopoldville. Her work did more than sustain Laurent's reputation. It provided tangible protection for her family, a buffer against the casual cruelties that defined life for most workers. It was a delicate equilibrium, but one she had maintained successfully for years. Around mid-morning, Ntumba, Kadima, and Baraka appeared at the kitchen entrance as they often did when school lessons in the workers' quarters concluded. Ntumba had been helping with morning chores at the forge. Kadima had assisted the older women with collecting firewood. Baraka, still too young for productive work, had simply tried to be helpful in ways that mostly involved staying out of adults' paths. Amara gave them leftover bread from the morning meal and issued her standard instructions. They should remain where she could see them. Ntumba was responsible for his younger siblings. Baraka was not to wander off. The boy, serious, beyond his 8 years, nodded his understanding and accepted the responsibility with the gravity of someone twice his age. Amara watched them settle in the small courtyard adjacent to the kitchen, their laughter cutting through the rhythmic sounds of cooking. For a brief moment, she let herself imagine different futures for them. Perhaps Ntumba could learn metalworking skills advanced enough to secure better positions. Perhaps Kadima could somehow access the education that Mama Nyanya had given her. Perhaps Baraka could grow up in an independent Congo, where being born in workers' quarters did not predetermine every aspect of one's life. These were dangerous thoughts, she knew. Dreams that could break a mother's heart by revealing the vast gulf between possibility and probability. But they were all she had to offer her children beyond love and what protection her position could provide. The morning progressed swiftly through lunch preparation. The guests arrived at noon, emerging from vehicles in clouds of red dust. Men in lightweight suits speaking loudly about copper prices, labor efficiency, and the looming question of what independence would mean for their operations. Amara could hear fragments of their conversations as servants moved between kitchen and dining room, their voices confident with the certainty of those who had always controlled resources and saw no reason that should change. The lunch succeeded brilliantly. She could gauge success by the quality of silence that fell when guests first tasted each course, by the appreciative comments that filtered back to the kitchen through the serving staff. Laurent was clearly pleased, and even Veronique sent word of her satisfaction through Nima. It was approaching 3 in the afternoon when Amara realized she had not seen the children for some time. Normally, they reappeared around midday, hungry or simply wanting to be near their mother. Their absence created a small knot of unease in her stomach, though she reassured herself that they had probably become absorbed in play and lost track of time. It was Tumelo who brought the first alarming news. Arriving breathless in the kitchen doorway, she had gone to the storage building near the processing facilities to retrieve supplies and had seen smoke. Thick, black smoke billowing from the old equipment shed that stood between the mining operations and workers' quarters. Amara's heart seemed to stop beating for several seconds. The old shed had not been used for its original purpose in years, serving instead as storage for broken machinery and discarded tools that Laurent kept meaning to have sorted and sold for scrap. The structure was wooden, its boards weathered gray by sun and rain, gaps between planks wide enough to see through. It should have been demolished years ago, but had lingered in that state of deferred maintenance that characterized anything not directly profitable. When Amara reached the building, flames were already consuming the structure with terrifying speed. The dry wood burned as though it had been soaked in kerosene, and the heat radiating from the inferno was so intense it stopped her several meters away. But it was the sound that transformed her blood to ice water. Screaming. High-pitched and desperate, the unmistakable voices of children in mortal terror. She knew those voices the way she knew her own heartbeat. Ntumba was calling for her, his voice cracking with panic. Kadima was shrieking, the sound cutting through the roar of flames. And beneath it all, Baraka was crying, that particular wail that spoke of pain and fear beyond a 4-year-old's ability to comprehend. Amara screamed their names and lunged toward the entrance, but strong hands caught her around the waist and pulled her back. It was Bakari, who had seen the smoke from the forge and come running. He held her as she fought
with inhuman strength born of desperation, her fingernails drawing blood from his arms as she clawed to break free. She was screaming that her babies were inside, that she had to reach them, that they were burning. Bakari was shouting back that she would die, that the structure was collapsing, that there was nothing anyone could do. Other men were trying to approach the entrance with wet blankets wrapped around their heads, but the heat drove them back before they could get within 3 meters of the door. The flames had created their own wind, sucking oxygen into the building and sending sparks spiraling into the air like malevolent fireflies. The screaming from inside the shed grew weaker, more sporadic. Amara stopped fighting and went completely limp in Bakari's arms, a sound emerging from her throat that was neither scream nor sob, but something more fundamental. The noise of a soul being torn in half while still trapped in living flesh. She sagged to her knees in the red dirt, and Bakari knelt with her, both of them staring at the inferno that had swallowed their children. The roof collapsed inward with a shower of sparks and a sound like a giant exhaling its final breath. After that, there were no more screams from inside, only the crackling roar of fire consuming everything it touched. The blaze burned for nearly 3 hours before enough water could be brought to douse the flames completely. Workers formed bucket chains from the nearest wells, but the shed was far from any adequate water source, and by the time they had extinguished the fire, there was nothing left but charred timbers and ash, still glowing red in places. When it was finally cool enough to approach the ruins, they found 3 small bodies in the far corner. so badly burned they were barely recognizable as human. Ntumba had tried to shield his younger siblings with his own body, his arms still wrapped around them, even in death. They had been huddled against the back wall, as far from the flames as they could get, though it had made no difference in the end. What the initial investigation revealed turned the tragedy into something far worse than accident. The shed door, which should have swung freely on its hinges, had been barred from the outside. Someone had deliberately trapped the children inside before setting the building ablaze. A length of metal pipe had been wedged through the door handle and braced against a support post, making it impossible to open from within. The discovery sent a wave of cold horror through everyone who saw it. This had not been a case of children playing with matches or an accidental ignition. This was murder, calculated and cruel. But who would murder 3 children, and why? Philippe Mwamba appeared at the fire scene approximately an hour after the blaze had been extinguished, claiming he had been riding in the distant hills, inspecting fence lines, and had only noticed the smoke column when returning to the main house. He expressed what seemed like genuine shock at the tragedy, speaking to his father about the unfortunate loss of valuable workers' children, and suggesting that perhaps they had been playing some game that went horribly wrong. Maybe one child had barred the door as part of their play, he theorized, not understanding the danger when fire broke out. His explanation sounded almost plausible to those who wanted to believe it, who needed to believe that such evil could not exist in their midst. But Nima, one of the younger kitchen assistants, had seen something that morning. She had gone into the forest edge near the workers' quarters to collect wild herbs that Amara liked to use in certain dishes, plants that grew only in the shade of larger trees. While searching for the specific leaves she needed, she had seen Philippe near the old equipment shed talking to 3 small figures. She had been too far away to hear the conversation, but she had seen him laughing, seen him gesturing toward the shed, seen the children follow him inside. She had thought nothing of it at the time, assuming he was showing them something, perhaps even doing something kind for once. It was only after the fire, after the bodies were found, that the memory took on its true horrifying significance. Nima waited 3 days after the funeral before telling Amara what she had witnessed. She was terrified of what might happen if she spoke, knowing that accusing the master's son of murder could result in her own death. But she could also not live with the knowledge locked inside her, could not look at Amara's devastated face each day and say nothing. She found Amara alone in the kitchen late one evening, mechanically preparing dough for the next day's bread, her movements automatic after so many years of routine. Nima's voice shook as she described what she had seen that morning. Philippe talking to the children, Philippe leading them into the shed, Philippe emerging alone and walking away whistling, looking pleased with himself as though he had just accomplished something clever. Amara said nothing as she listened. She did not cry, or scream, or rage. She simply continued kneading the dough, her hands working the mass of flour and water with steady, rhythmic pressure. When Nima finished speaking, Amara nodded once and thanked her in a voice so flat and empty it was more frightening than any display of emotion would have been. She told Nima to never speak of this to anyone else, to forget she had seen anything, to protect herself. The younger woman left the kitchen quickly, unsettled by the absolute blankness in Amara's eyes, as though she were looking at someone who had died but whose body had not yet realized it should stop moving. That night, Amara did not return to the cabin that she had shared with Bakari and the children. She could not bear to enter that space now filled with absences so profound that they had physical weight. Instead, she walked through the darkness to the ruins of the equipment shed. The smell of smoke still hung heavy in the air, and the ground was still warm beneath her feet. She knelt in the ashes where her children had died, letting the soot coat her hands and clothes, and she made promises that only the dead could hear. She whispered to the scorched earth about Ntumba, about Kadima, about Baraka. She promised she would not forget. She promised they would have justice. She promised that those responsible would pay a price so complete and terrible that it would echo through generations. Amara remained there until dawn, and when she finally stood and walked back towards the estate, something fundamental had changed. She was no longer simply Amara Kiboko, the cook who had lost her children to a cruel master's son. She was becoming something else, something harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous. During her night vigil in the ashes, she had chosen a new name for this new self. She would be Amara Lumumba, taking the surname of the independence leader who had dared to imagine a Congo free from
those who saw her people as resources to be extracted and discarded. Patrice Lumumba had fought for his people's freedom with words and vision. She would fight for her own freedom with knowledge and patience and the ancient secrets that Mama Nyanja had taught her. In the days that followed the funeral, Amara maintained her duties in the kitchen with mechanical precision. She prepared meals, supervised her staff, ensured that every dish leaving the kitchen met the exacting standards that had made La Colline Dorée famous. But those who knew her well noticed subtle changes that left them deeply uneasy. Makari saw it first. His wife had always been quiet and controlled, but now her silence had a different quality. It was not grief, though grief was certainly present. It was something more calculated, more purposeful. She spent hours awake at night, sitting by the cabin window and staring toward the main house with an expression he could not decipher. When he tried to speak about the future, about perhaps trying to have more children eventually, she looked at him as though he were speaking a language she no longer understood. She told him there was no future to discuss, only the present, and the present required all her attention. In the kitchen, Amara began implementing changes that seemed minor, but struck her assistants as significant. She insisted on personally handling all final preparations for any dish destined for the Muamba family table, no longer allowing her staff to add finishing touches or final seasonings. When questioned about this departure from previous practice, she explained it was necessary to maintain absolute consistency and quality, that she could not risk any variation in dishes served to the family. She also began keeping certain herbs and ingredients in a locked cabinet, storing them separately from the general pantry supplies. When Asha asked about these unfamiliar plants, Amara explained they were specialty ingredients reserved for very particular applications, too valuable and rare to risk misuse through ignorance. What her staff did not know was that Amara had begun making nocturnal expeditions into the forests surrounding the estate. Using knowledge that Mama Nyanja had transmitted to her years ago, she collected plants that grew only in specific conditions, that thrived only where certain types of death had enriched the soil. She gathered mushrooms that sprouted from rotting logs deep in the forest, their caps a particular shade of purple that Mama Nyanja had taught her to recognize. She harvested roots that required excavation at precise lunar phases, roots that smelled of earth and something darker. She collected seeds from vines that strangled their host's trees and leaves from plants that grew only in places where larger animals had died and decomposed. Mama Nyanja had taught her about these plants when she was young, but always with severe cautions. The old woman had shown her dried specimens stored in cloth bags marked with symbols that predated any written language Amara knew. Some were for healing pains that colonial doctors could not address, Mama Nyanja had explained, holding up samples of innocuous-looking bark. These could ease the suffering of women in childbirth, could calm the fevered brain, could grant sleep to those in too much pain to rest. But others, she had said, lowering her voice to a whisper even though they were alone, others were for situations when healing was no longer possible, when the only justice available existed outside any legal system. These plants were for moments when the world's cruelty exceeded what any human should be expected to endure,
when the only response left was to become as dangerous as those who had destroyed everything you loved. Amara now understood with perfect clarity what Mama Nyanja had meant. During the months of late 1958 and early 1959, she began her education in earnest. She experimented carefully, starting with minute doses so small they would cause discomfort, but nothing that could be traced or prove fatal. She selected Philippe as her initial subject, adding infinitesimal quantities of her preparations to dishes she knew he particularly enjoyed. Nothing that could kill him. Not yet. That would come later, and it would be neither quick nor private. First, she wanted him to suffer uncertainty, to question his own health, to feel his body betraying him in ways he could not explain or control. Philippe began complaining of digestive distress with increasing frequency. He experienced stomach pains that came and went without apparent pattern. He suffered bouts of nausea that struck at unpredictable times. His sleep became disturbed, plagued by nightmares he could not quite remember upon waking, but which left him exhausted and anxious. He developed headaches that no medicine seemed to relieve. His hands sometimes trembled for no reason he could identify. He consulted doctors in Élisabethville, even traveling to Leopoldville to see a specialist recommended by his father's business associates. None could find a cause for his symptoms. Some suggested psychological stress, perhaps anxiety about independence and political changes. Others recommended dietary modifications, avoiding rich foods and alcohol. One particularly observant doctor suggested that perhaps he should avoid heavily spiced dishes for a period, to give his digestive system time to recover from whatever was troubling it. Amara almost smiled when she overheard that recommendation being discussed in the dining room. If only these educated doctors understood that the problem was not the spices themselves, but rather the special additions she had been incorporating, the carefully calculated doses of substances that would make his body turn against him gradually, preparing him for what was to come. Meanwhile, Amara observed and studied. She paid attention to the household's patterns and rhythms with a focus she had never applied before. She noted what time each family member typically ate breakfast, who preferred which dishes, who had food preferences or restrictions. She discovered that Laurent favored rich, complex sauces, the kind that could mask subtle additions. She learned that Veronica preferred delicate preparations with minimal seasoning, which would require different approaches. She observed that Philippe, despite his complaints, continued eating heartily whenever he felt temporarily well, unable to resist the cuisine that had made the estate famous. Most importantly, she learned that the family was planning something significant for early 1959. Celeste, Laurent's youngest daughter, had become engaged to Sylvester Kalala, eldest son of another powerful mining family. The wedding was scheduled for late January and would represent the social event of the season in Katanga. It would unite two of the most influential families in the province, families that had prospered under colonial rule, positioning themselves to continue prospering regardless of what independence might bring. The guest list would include everyone who mattered in the region's complex web of power and extraction. Veronique began consulting with Amara about the wedding feast months in advance, arriving in the kitchen with notebooks full of ideas culled from French magazines and memories of elaborate meals she had attended in Brussels. She emphasized repeatedly that the wedding needed to be absolutely perfect, an intimate celebration for close family and dear relatives that would be remembered for generations. Every dish must be flawless, she insisted. Every detail must reflect the Mwamba family's sophistication and refinement. The meal would be a statement about who they were and what they represented, a declaration of their permanent place in whatever Congo emerged from independence. Amara assured her that the meal would indeed be perfect, making promises she fully intended to keep. It would be perfect in ways that Veronique could not imagine, executed with a precision that would be studied and whispered about for generations, though not for the reasons the family anticipated. Yes, she promised, it would be absolutely perfect, perfectly planned, perfectly timed, perfectly final. During the long, dry season nights, Amada began planning in earnest. This would not be a simple matter of poisoning food and hoping for the best. That approach was too crude, too uncertain, lacking in the artistry that such an act demanded. She wanted something more elegant, more precisely calibrated. She wanted each person who attended that wedding feast to receive exactly what they deserved, measured in perfect proportion to their guilt and complicity. She began researching who would be present at the wedding, through careful attention to conversations she overheard, letters she glimpsed being written, preparations she observed. She constructed a detailed mental map of every guest who would sit at that table. The complete Mwamba family would be there, including Laurent, Veronique, Philippe, Celeste, and the younger son, Charles. The Kalala family would come in force, bringing Sylvester's parents, Bernard and Eugenie, his two brothers, Marcel and Thierry, and his sister, Claudine. There would be various aunts, uncles, and cousins from both families, people whose wealth and comfort had been built on the suffering of thousands, people who had never questioned their right to extract value from land and people they considered theirs by some natural order. 17 people in total. 17 lives that had benefited directly or indirectly from a system that treated human beings as property and resources. 17 people who had attended elegant dinners and sophisticated gatherings while workers died in mine collapses, while families were separated for profit, while children like Ntumba, Kadima, and Baraka lived and died without anyone in power considering their lives worth protecting. Each name she identified was added to her mental list, and for each name, she began planning a specific fate. Laurent, who had built his empire on calculated cruelty and who had protected his son from consequences when 3 children burned to death, would receive the centerpiece treatment, both literally and figuratively. His death would anchor everything else. Philippe, the direct murderer, who had locked 3 children in a shed and set it ablaze because he found their terror entertaining, would have a slower progression of symptoms, a death designed to maximize his suffering and awareness of what was happening. She wanted him to understand, to know with certainty in his final moments that justice had found him. Veronique, who had lived her entire life insulated by wealth extracted from others' suffering, who had never questioned the system that provided her comfort, would die confused and frightened, unable to comprehend what was happening as her carefully controlled world collapsed into chaos. The others would receive their own particular fates, calibrated to reflect their specific roles in perpetuating injustice. Amada spent the remainder of 1958 perfecting her preparations, not just the culinary ones, though those required their own extensive work, but the other recipes, the ones Mama Nyanja had taught her in whispers and which she had expanded through careful experimentation. She tested dosages on small animals first, rats that infested the storage areas, stray dogs that wandered the estate grounds. She studied effects carefully, noting how quickly symptoms appeared, how they progressed, what signs preceded death. She calculated action times with precision, determining which substances worked quickly and which built gradually, which could be masked in rich sauces and which required more delicate vehicles. One particularly important discovery came from her experiments with timing and sequence. She found that she could prepare dishes that would affect children differently than adults, that would induce deep sleep rather than the more severe effects intended for others. This was crucial as she had learned that several of the guests would be bringing young children to the wedding. Sylvester's younger siblings included 2 children under 10, and various cousins planned to bring their offspring. Amada had no interest in harming innocents. Her justice was surgical, directed only at those who bore responsibility for the system that had killed her children. The young ones would receive special preparations, porridges and sweetened milk that would make them sleep peacefully through the entire evening, unaware of what unfolded around them. During her nocturnal expeditions to the forests, she also collected plants with gentler properties, substances that would induce restful sleep without causing harm. These she stored separately, labeled in her own private code so she would never confuse them with the darker preparations. The children would be safe. They would wake the next morning with no memory of the night before, confused perhaps, but unharmed. Let them grow up and, perhaps in time, question what they had been taught about who deserved power and who deserved mercy. When the rainy season began in late 1958, Amara Lumumba was ready. She had transformed from grieving mother into something the colonial authorities and complicit Congolese elite could never have anticipated. She had become a woman with knowledge, purpose, and most importantly, nothing remaining to lose. The wedding of Celeste Mwamba and Sylvester Kalala would be remembered for generations, but not as a celebration of union and continued prosperity. It would be remembered as the moment when patience finally ran out, when accumulated injustice found its reckoning, when the kitchen that had fed the powerful for decades served its final, perfect meal. During the last few weeks of preparation, Amara began leaving traces of her transformation in the only place she had absolute control.
Could record them safely. She wrote in her secret notebook, the same one where Mama Nyanja had first taught her to form letters in Kikongo and French. But now she wrote not recipes, but reflections on the nature of justice, on the price of silence, on what happens when human beings are pushed beyond all reasonable endurance. She wrote one humid December night by candlelight that they had all thought the workers were invisible, that they did not see or remember or feel the casual cruelties inflicted daily. But she and others like her were the living memory of every sin committed in pursuit of profit and power. And memory, when it finally speaks, does so with a voice that carries across generations and continents. Bakari noticed that she had begun signing her notes with her chosen surname, Lumumba, rather than Kiboko. When he asked about this change, she explained simply that she had decided to honor a man who believed in freedom and dignity for all people. She said that taking his name was a way of declaring that she too would fight for freedom, though perhaps in ways different from his speeches and political organizing. Bakari did not fully understand what she meant, but something in her tone, in the absolute certainty of her voice, made him decide not to press for clarification. There were things happening in his wife's mind and heart that he could sense but not fully grasp, currents too deep and cold for him to navigate safely. The morning of January 24, 1959 arrived with the peculiar clarity that sometimes blessed Katanga during the height of the rainy season. The previous week's storms had washed the air clean, and visibility extended for kilometers across the red hills. It was Celeste Mwamba's wedding day, and La Colline Dorée had been transformed into something approaching a European fantasy of tropical elegance. White fabric draped from every available surface, flowers imported from South Africa at enormous expense perfumed the air. Musicians had been brought from Élisabethville to provide entertainment. The dining hall had been decorated with a lavishness that proclaimed the family's wealth and taste to anyone who might doubt it. Amara had risen at 2 in the morning, not from nervousness or uncertainty, but because she had an enormous amount of work ahead, and every element required perfect execution. This was her masterpiece, the culmination of months of planning and years of accumulated knowledge. She moved through the pre-dawn darkness toward the kitchen with a calmness that came from absolute clarity of purpose. She knew exactly what needed to happen, and she possessed both the skill and the materials to ensure it would unfold precisely as she had envisioned. The main house kitchen had been prepared for days, transformed into what resembled a military command center more than a cooking space. All 3 ovens were fired and ready. Multiple pots of different sizes waited on the great stove. Her 4 assistants would arrive within the hour, each with specific tasks that Amara had rehearsed with them until they could execute their roles flawlessly.
But as always, she would maintain absolute control over the most critical elements, the seasonings, the sauces, the final touches that would transform this meal from merely excellent into something that would be discussed in whispers for generations to come. The menu had been designed with a complexity that would showcase every skill Amara possessed, while also providing the perfect vehicles for her special preparations. She would begin with a chilled soup made from local tomatoes and peppers, blended smooth and served with a swirl of cream. A dish that would awaken the palate and prepare the digestive system for what followed. The second course would feature smoked fish from Lake Tanganyika, presented on small rounds of bread with a delicate herb butter that Amara had prepared over the previous week, allowing the flavors to meld and mature. For the main courses, she had planned an array that would satisfy even the most demanding European tastes, while incorporating the finest local ingredients. There would be roasted guinea fowl, their skin crisped to perfection and glazed with a reduction that combined palm wine, wild honey, and carefully selected forest mushrooms. A whole roasted antelope haunch, procured from hunters who worked the forests beyond the estate boundaries, seasoned with a complex rub that had taken her 3 days to perfect. Grilled fish from the Congo River, each one butterflied and cooked over charcoal, then dressed with a sauce that married French technique with African ingredients in ways that made both traditions unrecognizable and newly magnificent. The side dishes would be equally elaborate. There would be fufu made from the finest cassava flour, shaped into perfect spheres and arranged artfully on serving platters. Rice cooked in broth and mixed with vegetables that had been diced so uniformly they looked like jewels scattered through the grains. Greens that Amara had personally selected from the estate garden that morning, cooked just until tender and dressed with palm oil infused with garlic and hot peppers. Sweet potatoes that had been twice cooked, first boiled, then roasted until their exteriors caramelized while their interiors remained creamy. For dessert, she had prepared her interpretation of a French custard tart, but one transformed by the addition of tropical fruits and local vanilla that made it something new. There would also be small chocolate confections, each one hand-formed and filled with passion fruit cream, a delicacy that required precision and patience to execute properly. But woven throughout this elaborate feast were her other preparations, the ones that gave this meal its true purpose. For Laurent, she had prepared a special portion of the guinea fowl, selecting the choicest pieces and treating them with a glaze that incorporated extracts from 3 different toxic plants. The combination would work gradually but inexorably, first causing a sensation of warmth spreading through his chest, then progressing to difficulty breathing, and finally to complete respiratory failure. For Veronique, Amara had created a variation of the fish course that included compounds derived from certain mushrooms she had collected during the rainy season. These would cause vivid hallucinations before death, terrifying visions that would make her final moments a journey into psychological horror. Philippe's portions would receive the most complex treatment of all. Amara had prepared for him a combination of substances that would work in sequence rather than simultaneously. First would come intense abdominal cramping, pain so severe it would double him over and leave him gasping. Then his nervous system would begin to fail, starting with loss of fine motor control in his hands and gradually progressing until he could no longer stand or even sit upright. Finally, would come paralysis that left him conscious and aware but unable to move or speak, trapped in a failing body while his mind remained alert enough to understand exactly what was happening to him. She wanted him to have time to think about 3 children burning at a locked shed, to wonder if this was what they had felt, to know with absolute certainty that this was justice for what he had done. But most important among all her preparations were those intended for the children. There would be 4 young ones present at the wedding, ranging in age from 5 to 11. For them, Imara had prepared special dishes that looked and tasted appealing to young palates, but which contained strong sedatives derived from plants that Mama Nyanja had shown her years ago. These were the same preparations traditionally used by village healers to calm feverish children or help those in pain sleep through the night. The children would eat their special meals, find themselves growing sleepy, and be taken to rest in upstairs rooms by servants who would assume they were simply tired from the day's excitement. As dawn broke over Katanga on that January morning, Imara's assistants began arriving at the kitchen. Nima came first, as she always did, her arms already dusted with flour from the bread she had been preparing at home. Aisha arrived next, carrying the special knives she preferred for butchering and trimming meats. Tumelo came with baskets of vegetables from the estate garden, each one inspected and selected according to Imara's exacting standards. The youngest assistant, a girl named Patience, who had joined the kitchen staff only 6 months earlier, arrived last, nervous and excited to be part of such an important occasion. What none of them knew was that Imara would personally handle every final seasoning, every sauce, every element that would actually go on to the plates. She had been very clear about this, explaining that for an event of this importance, she needed to control quality absolutely at every stage. Her assistants accepted this without question, accustomed to her perfectionism and grateful that she was taking responsibility for the most pressure-filled aspects of the work. The morning progressed in controlled chaos, the kitchen filling with the sounds and smells of ambitious cooking. Ovens radiated heat that made the space almost unbearable despite the early hour. Pots bubbled and steamed, knives moved in rhythmic patterns against cutting boards. But periodically she would step into the pantry, ostensibly to retrieve ingredients, and there she would add her special preparations to specific dishes. She worked with the precision of someone who had rehearsed every movement countless times, measuring out exact quantities from small vials she had prepared over previous weeks, incorporating them into sauces and glazes and marinades in ways that made them completely undetectable. The toxic compounds had no taste that would alert the diners, no smell that would be of warning, no appearance that would cause suspicion. Around mid-morning, the guests began arriving at La Colline Dorée. Vehicles churned up the long drive in clouds of red dust, disgorging passengers dressed in their finest clothes. The men wore lightweight suits tailored in Élisabethville or Leopoldville, their shoes polished to mirror brightness despite the inevitable dust. The women wore dresses that proclaimed both sophistication and wealth, their jewelry catching the sunlight, their hair arranged in styles that had required hours of preparation. Children tumbled from vehicles in miniature versions of adult finery, already beginning to wilt in the heat despite the relatively early hour. Imara observed the arrivals through the kitchen window, identifying each guest and mentally checking them against her list. There was Bernard Kalala, the groom's father, a thick-bodied man whose fortune came from controlling mineral exports through a network of contacts in Belgium and South Africa. Beside him walked his wife Eugenie, thin and nervous, her hands moving constantly as though she could not bear to be still. Their sons Marcel and Thierry followed, both in their early 20s, both already involved in their father's business operations. The wedding ceremony was scheduled for noon in the estate's garden under a pavilion that had been erected specifically for the occasion. White silk draped from poles created an elegant space that provided shade while allowing breezes to pass through. Chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing an improvised altar decorated with flowers and religious symbols. Reverend Kimbangu, who served the European and African elite of Katanga with equal deference, would officiate the ceremony with his characteristic blend of Christian orthodoxy and performative gravitas. Imara paid little attention to the ceremony itself, focused instead on the final preparations for the feast that would follow. This was the critical period when timing became everything, when dishes had to be finished at precisely the right moments to ensure they would be served at optimal temperature and texture. Around 1 in the afternoon, the ceremony concluded and guests began making their way from the garden toward the main house. There was a brief reception period during which drinks were served on the veranda, giving everyone time to offer congratulations to the newly married couple. The dining hall had been transformed into something approaching a European fantasy. The long table could seat 20 comfortably, though only 17 places had been set for this intimate family gathering.
Caught and refracted light from windows and candles. Silver serving pieces gleamed against white linen. Flower arrangements that had cost more than most workers earned in a month perfumed the air with imported fragrances. Before the meal began, Amara had one more crucial task to complete. She prepared special dishes for the 4 children present, carrying them personally to the smaller table that had been set up for the young ones in an adjoining room. The children were delighted by the attention from the famous cook, chattering excitedly as she served them sweet porridge flavored with honey and cinnamon, along with warm milk that had been sweetened and flavored with vanilla and nutmeg. Within 15 minutes, the sedatives began taking effect. The youngest child started yawning, rubbing her eyes with small fists. The others followed shortly after, their movements becoming sluggish, their speech slowing. The servants Amara had briefed earlier gently guided them upstairs to bedrooms that had been prepared, tucking them into beds where they would sleep deeply and peacefully for the next 8 to 10 hours, completely insulated from what was about to unfold in the dining hall below. With the children safely removed, Amara returned to the kitchen for the final orchestration. Her assistants had prepared the dishes according to her instructions, but now she would add the finishing touches that would transform this meal from magnificent to fatal. The first course was served without incident. Servers carried soup bowls into the dining hall on large trays, placing them before each guest with practiced precision. The chilled tomato and pepper soup was received with appreciative murmurs, exactly the refreshing start one wanted on a hot afternoon. The main courses arrived in a carefully choreographed sequence. First came the roasted guinea fowl, arranged on platters with artistic precision, the glazed skin catching the light and promising flavors that the guests anticipated eagerly. Laurent, seated at the head of the table in his position as patriarch and host, received the choicest portions as was traditional. He carved into the meat with obvious satisfaction, raising his first bite in a toast to the newly married couple before consuming it. Veronique, seated beside him, took more modest portions but ate with the same unconscious entitlement that had characterized her entire life. Philippe, despite his recent health complaints, found himself unable to resist the spectacular food, taking generous servings of multiple dishes. The feast continued for nearly 2 hours, course following course in the progression Amara had planned so carefully. Guests ate enthusiastically, praising each dish, calling for second helpings of particular favorites, discussing the food with the kind of detailed attention that the truly wealthy could afford to give to meals. Laurent stood at one point to make a toast, publicly thanking his cook for the magnificent feast and prompting a round of applause from the assembled guests. Amara, watching from the kitchen doorway, allowed herself a small, cold smile. It was approaching 4 in the afternoon when the first symptoms began manifesting. Bernard Kalala, who had eaten particularly heartily throughout the meal, suddenly went pale mid-sentence. He had been discussing copper prices with one of Laurent's cousins when his face lost all color and his hand went to his chest. His wife, noticing his distress, asked if he was well, but before he could answer, she herself felt a wave of intense nausea that made the room seem to tilt around her. Within minutes, the elegant dining hall began transforming into a scene of chaos and horror. Guests started rising abruptly from their chairs, some clutching their stomachs, others staggering toward doors in search of fresh air. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.